This is Will here, and this episode is with Professor Jeannette Mageo from Washington State University. We discuss her research on dream data collection and analysis. Her work blends psychology and anthropology in really neat ways, where, for example, she discusses how dreams can connect with collective cultural models, which reveal dreams as more of a part of a shared cultural history and identity and experience, and not strictly an individual thing that's in our heads. Dreams are linked with our collective cultural realities. She's incredibly prolific, and you can find a lot of her work on Google Scholar. Her forthcoming book is called The Mimetic Nature of Dream Mentation, American Selves and Reformation, and I'll also place a link to her faculty profile below. You were saying, in terms of your work on dreaming and anthropology, I guess just to reiterate what we were just talking about before I started the recording, how subjectivity in anthropology is accounted for, how different scholars tackle it in different ways, trying to get people's experiences. I guess experience near interviewing has been like one of those methodologies trying to get at that. And for you use dreams and, interviews in order to get more into what those dreams mean and everything, but using dreams as like an entryway into that seems really fascinating.
Well, I really do think that that dreams are the royal road to subjectivity. That when we're in dreams, we are in the territory of the subject, and that can be a rather opaque territory. I mean, it's also possible to see it and understand it through hermeneutics, through interpretation, but that's where we are, and it's a it can be partially opaque territory because we're defended against sharing our subjectivities with one another. I mean, we're so vulnerable in that territory of the self. But that vulnerability is the price of real self-knowledge, because really knowing yourself is knowing yourself as a subject.
Mm. Yeah. And I think that links to your work really well on attachment. And I guess I don't know that I've read many anthropologists that engage as deeply with attachment as you have. And, I haven't read all of the literature on it, but I don't know how you sort of position yourself in respect to like attachment and some of those more psychological theories.
Well, I don't know. You may have a further question about attachment per se, and my work on attachment. But uh, for me, child development is critical to the ontology of the self, right? I mean, that's the early child development. I agree with psychoanalytic perspectives here. It all begins in those very early years. We are formed as cultural beings in those early years, and through the way our cultures establish relationships, those early relationships, as in Vygotsky's activity theory, we're always taking those relationships in and becoming a self through them. So, um, you know, attachment is handled very differently in different cultures. But people tend not to realize this. They tend not to think objectively about their ways of organizing attachment relationships, because this is so emotional and then often so sentimentalized for everyone. So, uh, you know, Americans can look at other ways of handling attachment, like Samoan ways of handling attachment, where the child is always in contact with its close relative's body, not just the mother, but mothers and what is now called allo mothers, but brothers and sisters and other relatives all the time for a while, and then abruptly turned over to usually a little girl, sometimes a little boy, to care for. And so that's a traumatic experience for the little one. And the result is, also the child who was given the care of the infant often didn't feed them adequately. And, so it's probably a very traumatic experience. And so Americans can look at that and say, oh, yes, oh, well, that must be bad or hard or something. But attachment American style, I think, can be quite traumatic too. But the traumas of everyday early life or something like that. I mean, so we focus attachment on one person, mother, but this person goes away. So that, I think, can be a traumatic experience too. I call it the intermittent attachment pattern. And uh, but again, we don't see this. So mother goes out, you show up as a babysitter, and the baby cries, and there's nothing you can do. It's still crying, and so people just say, "Oh, but that's normal." It looks pretty traumatic to me. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't, or that I don't mean to pose moral judgments here, but more just to say we need to look at what's there. We need to see what we're doing and how we're doing it. Usually what people are doing in culture is they're building personalities, they're forming personalities, they're helping little ones form personalities that are in consonance with their societies and work well in their societies. So, but but our societies are not ideal, right? We live in a capitalist society that is in many ways exploitive of us, that is unequal, has many things that are not virtuous about it. So here we are unconsciously making people who fit perfectly in that society. So that's why it's important to take a critical view of these early relationships and ask ourselves what precisely we are doing, where does it lead, and is that what we want to do, or might we want to do it somehow differently?
Right. Yeah. It reminds me of, in one of your recent articles, you talked about like the super masculinity model, because that one's tied up with capitalism, with culture, with the type of images that we kind of give attention to, but also give us a sort of model with which we represent ourselves within dreams. Especially, I want to know if you could talk a little bit about how all of those things sort of intersect, because there you have subjectivity, sort of like an individual's model that comes out in the dream, aligning with the cultural model. Because I think that cultural model, integrating that into this whole paradigm, I think is one of the really interesting things reading through some of your work about sort of understanding that cultural model.
Keep me on track here. But so this takes me back to something I've been discussing recently, which is, and that I discuss in my article, Dreaming and Its Discontents, published in Ethos, about the distinction between emotion and subjectivity, or emotion and feeling, which is something that Shordash discusses and other people discuss. But sort of, I'm not satisfied with existing discussions of this. I think there's that emotion. So there's this work by Erckman on emotion, which you may know, which he posits that there are 8 basic emotions that can be found in cultures worldwide. And his evidence for this is facial expressions, where you show that facial expression to people in various different cultures, and they come up with, oh, that's sadness, or oh, that's anger, or he says there are just 8 of them. Now, the cultural constructionists like Lutz, on the other hand, say, no, they're so different from culture to culture. And I think something in between that is true. I think that emotions on some level are affective, almost quasi-biological states. Like when you're angry, it's like it's physiological, right? Your heart races, you get red like Mars, like the Greek god Mars, right? So there's strong physiological aspects to it, and that there may be some affective states that at least there are strong analogs for in all cultures, even if they're constructed slightly differently. But the other end of the spectrum is cultural models. And these are going to be quite different from culture to culture, although there will be things that cultures have in common. If, for instance, they have a similar socioeconomic system, like there may be things that there may be cultural models that all capitalist cultures have in common, right? If cultures have strong structural similarities, they may have similarities among their cultural models as well. But cultural models, again, the other end of the spectrum, that's where cultures are, they are unique. It's just that culture, we got to do ethnography on it because there are no people like that anywhere else, right?
Right.
So I think feeling is something medial. So I think that feeling ranges between biology and emotion and cultural models. So, for instance, in English, you can say, oh, I feel so angry, right?
Mhm.
Or you could say, oh, I'm hot. So you can go to the purely biological, you can go to the quasi biological, but you can also say, well, I feel like they all left me behind.
Hmm.
As one dreamer in that article I mentioned earlier, Dreaming and Its Discontents, said. And I think her feeling left behind connects to a cultural model. She was in the dream concerned with achievement and with what I call the American upward bound model, where you're always supposed to climb socioeconomically, and you're supposed to end up higher on the hill at least than you began. You're supposed to climb to the top, right? And she was trying, but she was having a lot of trouble, and it related to many experiences in her past where she had felt others had left her behind. Like, sometimes her father was supposed to pick her up from work. Well, sometimes he didn't show up.
Hmm.
And then he went to prison. And and he wasn't always very supportive when he wasn't in prison either.
Hmm.
So, there's that. And other friends so she formed friends at school that, to try to supplement the lack of emotional support she got at home. But she felt those people too left her behind. So, and this was making it hard to succeed on her own, to climb to the top, right?
Hmm.
So feelings, they range back and forth. They connect various things, and which is also one of the things that psychologists have found that dreams do. Dreams are a state of hyperconnectivity, where various aspects of your memory and various centers in your brain, they all come together. Especially in REM dreams. REMing, as you may know, is quite a special state. It's not, we used to think it was the dream state. Now we know that dreams occur at other times as well. But um, uh, those longer narrative dreams that really do the kind of work that I'm talking about, that I believe do the work of culture, they tend to occur in REM sleep.
I think you touched on a lot of interesting things. I think one of the things that has, well, okay, thinking about, let's say, Renato Rosaldo's like Grief and the Headhunter's Rage, right? In that article, he's talking about how, you know, he finally understood the kind of rage that would lead someone to want to like cut another person's head off. And yeah, within anthropology, there's an understanding that, he is ultimately not from the Philippines. He's not from there. And I think I think at least conceptually, I think earlier in his work, he talked about how there was that disconnect of him ultimately not being a part of that culture, but ultimately not being able to fully understand and reconcile those types of feelings of rage related to grief. And I think that's something that's come up in some of my readings about emotions, of how anger and rage, I guess for lack of a better kind of term, is like a different kind of frequency emotion that often there tends to lie something behind it, whether it's judgment, whether it's sadness, whether it's like another emotion that's sort of also there. So I guess in thinking about emotions and like the physiology of like anger, hot, and all of these different associations that we have physiologically and emotionally with emotions and what happens in our lives, I wonder, to what extent have you kind of seen in your work that navigation between different types of emotions and how they've related to each other. Like, for example, about Rosaldo having, all this intense grief for, the death of his wife, of Shelley, and it manifesting as like the type of rage that would want to lead someone to like cut another person's head off.
So in regards to all of this, I am kind of a cognitive anthropologist. I mean, I'm also a psychoanalytic anthropologist, but yeah, I think it has a lot to do with the cultural models. I mean, say in Thailand, they would tell you to cool your heart, or in Bali, they tell you to manage your turbulent heart, right? And and then maybe you'd go to a black magician who would put a curse on whoever it was, right? But it wouldn't necessarily lead you to cut their head off.
Right.
So there's this relationship between emotions and cultural models, which again I think is mediated by feelings, because feelings are metaphors. When Dylan told me she felt left behind, she's speaking in a metaphor, and metaphors have this capacity to connect things. They're polysemous. They have multiple references. They can refer to one thing and another thing and another thing and another thing. And so this possibility of multiple reference allows many things to be connected. So to connect, see, there's got to be an interpretation there to connect this grief. I think that grief and rage are closely connected. I mean, you can see it in little kids who they stub their toe and then they're mad at the table. They're gonna hit the table because they're mad at the table for right, because hitting their toe, they might want to cry about that, but then the next thing they're so mad at the table. Okay, so I think grief and rage, just like fear and flight, are probably closely connected, very primordial kind of things, but then they get connected to a cultural model, which tells you how to direct those feelings, how it's appropriate to deal with those feelings. And these models are internalized very early, very far back. And so, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a really great way of thinking of it. And I think one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of data collection and research is like, how do we methodologically like operationalize collecting these types of things, right? Like, is it as simple as drawing a line between feelings, thoughts about feelings versus the physiology of it, sort of tackling them separately? Or is it just about recording people's experience in the moment, if you can, and then kind of working through that afterwards? You know what I mean? Like, you do mention about like a method of it in your 2019 article on dreamentation. I guess I wonder if you could speak on that a little bit.
So what's the name of the article again? I have so many.
Yeah. Ambiguity as dreamentation,
Oh, yeah.
supermasculinity,
Oh,
and
yeah.
ambivalence in American
And then,
idea dreams.
so your question again? No, I'm focused on the right article.
I wonder, because in that article you talk about like offering a sort of methodology with the 7 different like types of dreams,
Yeah.
like the as if dream and the
So what I'm suggesting there is that these types of ambiguity, that they represent that they represent dream mentation, that they represent ways of thinking about experience, the experiences of the subject, that's similar to, in some ways, to a logical way of thinking about things, in that it has analytic and synthetic components. The idea is you want to break things down and then put them back together again, right? Well, that's just what we do when we're writing a scholarly paper in logical analysis, right? You do a reading for a course and you analyze it, which is, you kind of break it down into parts and see what's there, right? Well, I'm suggesting that ambiguity represents a visual way of doing that, and hence the way of doing that dreams use. The dreams are doing the same thing we're doing now, that dreams are doing the same thing that you do in waking life, that they're trying to think through things. They just have a somewhat different way of doing it. And that if you look at different types of ambiguity, you can see that some of them disaggregate images. They break images down into parts, more or less completely. And other types of ambiguity kind of, but I think, that narrative is the synthetic component of dreams. Dream narratives kind of try to put it all back together again. But so dream ambiguity kind of breaks it down, and then dream narratives kind of puts it back together. So so the 7 types of ambiguity are a way of thinking about dreams. And, it's a method that would start with looking for types of ambiguity in dreams. And, but then, of course, you need a lot of data too, right? And the data is always going to be the individual and their associations to dreams and their life history. And if they're willing to do some free association with you, that's great too, or some role playing, that's great too. But you want as much information from them as they're willing and able to give you.
Right. And I guess that links to like your background in like more cognitive anthropology, sort of interplaying with like psychoanalysis and much more, I guess what we'd consider more like psychologically oriented, I guess type of like considerations in your work. And yeah, I guess I wonder to what extent you would consider like, let's say like something like William Dressler's cultural consonants and cultural consensus model of linking like people's anxieties, and how that tends to be related to how well they sort of coincide with, let's say, the dominant kind of cultural model that within which they're working through. I guess I wonder like to what extent you think that sort of coincides with what we're seeing and how we live our lives today, where we have the internet at our fingertips, where we can join, I guess, groups of people
So,
that we
so
haven't. I'm sorry.
I'm tempted to interrupt here just because I'm afraid you're going to pile so much on, and I'm not going to remember the early question by the time.
Right.
So let me try to remember that, and let me respond to the first part, and then maybe we can go on to what you're talking about now. So the cultural consonant stuff. Well, I really believe in cultural consonants, and I think that's an interesting way to assess what the cultural models are. But the thing is that cultural models are in some way or another always a Procrustean bed. They don't totally fit. They weren't made for you. They weren't made for me. They were made, they were made over time by lots of people, and in some sense, they represent a set of norms. So they're also maps and guides and tell you how to live in a social world and tell you how to succeed in a social world. And so it makes perfect sense to me that what the cultural consonance theorists say is true, which is you're happy and experience well-being in as much as you're consonant with the prevailing cultural models. But in my view, the human condition is we ain't, right? We try. God, we have to have those maps to live in a cultural world. You've got to have those maps, and you've got to get them as early as possible. But they to some extent don't work.
Right.
And that means they have to be changed. They have to be changed for each of us individually, and they have to be changed for our groups as well. And I think we do that work in dreams. So dreams are about cultural dissonance. And believe me, there's more of that than cultural consonance.
I think it makes me wonder to what extent, what the implications are that for like methods, right? Because I guess traditionally anthropology, we often conceptualize it as like, focus on groups and participant observer models. And at the same time, there's this recognition that, yeah, there is more dissonance than anything, and having to get the individual's subjective experience is an important part of contextualizing the sort of group experience. I don't know if you sort of agree with that kind of statement.
Yes, I do. It's psychological anthropologists in particular have always been trying to get below the surface of life, right?
Mm.
But up through the mid 20th centuries, they had very paternalistic, or at least some of them, not all of them. That's an overgeneralization. Some of them had paternalistic attitudes about how to do that. So we need, we're treading somewhat dangerous territory here because, again, this is a place where we're all vulnerable, but a very rich territory as well. But yeah, so next question.
In the article, you talk about Shakespeare's sonnet, how, I don't remember who was talking about it, but in terms of like it being very specific to a time, place, and culture. I'm sorry?
Beautiful poem. Bare ruined choirs where late the bird sang or something like that.
Yeah.
Very
And in the article, you're
sweet.
talking about how the meanings would be available to someone who's middle upper class English, whose mothers read to them sonnets, who grew up in a world that recalled King Henry's pillages, like all these different like contextual parts, right? And I wonder, it really, I think, speaks a lot what you're talking about in terms of like cultural models and individual subjectivity, how there's this connection to it. And I wonder what you think about like Joseph Campbell and like these kind of more generalist interpretations of like cultural stories that have been sort of, I guess, in some ways cobbled together to like have this sort of grand interpretation that kind of puts all cultures under like the same thing in order to construct these archetypes, like, the hero's myth and all these stories of like, I think it resonates with the Western audience, but I think has gotten some criticism as maybe not being as generalized as people assume. So I don't know if you have like sort of thoughts or like experiences dealing with like Joseph Campbell or any of these types of mythologies.
So I came originally myself from an interest in Jung, and um, Hero with a Thousand Faces is it's a wonderful book, and it's fun to read, and it's very multicultural. He talks about all these stories in different cultures. Um, uh, but for him and for Jung, the hero is where it's at, right? And in some sense or another, I don't know if you know James Hillman's later work on Jung, which is, if you don't take a look at it, it's very interesting. He was really hot for a while, but I don't know. I'm sure Jungians still read him, but he's very fun to read too. He's a good writer, and and he takes a kind of a critical look at all of this, but uh, it's a question of choosing your myth in some sense or another. So there may be some myths that work the worldwide, right? I mean, American superhero movies, they sell very well. In many other cultures, it works, right? And maybe it's a myth that works particularly in modernity. And so as a lot of places are becoming modern, that may help as well. But that's not the only myth. That's the myth we focused on. Why? Well, uh, uh, patriarchal culture where Freud got it right. Oedipus, father son, is the main thing and what it's all about, right? And so, and that may be everywhere, but it's not the only thing that's everywhere. Or it may be very strong and dominant in patriarchal cultures, and most cultures on the earth today, and going pretty far back historically, are patriarchal. So that might be a very relevant myth for all those places, but I'm not sure that's the way we want it to be. And there are other myths there, and there's certainly other myths that human beings have drawn upon, and draw upon more in other cultures or draw upon more at different historical times. And I think we're trying collectively to think that through. And first, we do it by, starting to co-opt a little. Now we've got some female superheroes who have a different orientation, right? So is that patriarchal myth co-opting women, or are women co-opting it? Probably a bit of both. But we keep trying to rewrite the myths, and um, and it's we do it also in our dreams. I think that we've got these various myths, various stories relate to our models, and our models are tethered to our socioeconomic and political systems and the moralities that go with those. And so we're working on changing it all, right? We hope to become more human.
Right. Yeah, that sounds really awesome. I I don't really have any more questions, but I was wondering if you had like a last word, or sort of maybe a statement on where you're sort of going in your research, like what direction it's taking you.
Well, I just finished a book that I submitted, and I will sooner or later, I hope, get published, which kind of tries to bring all of this together. It's called Mimesis in the Dream.
Hmm.
So that's the immediate next step for me. Beyond that, I'm hoping to do something, stage a conference or something, which may bring together recent thought about the dream in anthropology and psychology. Um, our disciplines are at this point so separate, and psychology, sort of politically and economically, is very much the dominant discipline. They're very much more powerful as a discipline than we are in anthropology. And to some extent, they've done that by aligning themselves with the science model of research. And I think they've gotten a lot out of that. A lot of interesting research has come out of it, but I think it needs to be linked back to a larger view of the human condition and of, in the terms of this interview, subjectivity, our actual experience of things, um, and with a larger humanistic framework. And so that's what I intend to be working on in the immediate time going forward.
That sounds really wonderful. That sounds really like interdisciplinary. That's really great. I really thank you so much for taking the time to come on. I've been really fascinated with like exploring subjectivities, and I think dreams is a really fascinating and insightful way of doing that. So I really appreciate you coming on.
Well, it's been so nice meeting you, Lucas, and I hope to see you at future meetings of the SPA, the Society for Psychological Anthropology, or the American Anthropological meeting. So if you're coming to those meetings, let me know, and maybe we can meet after COVID face to face.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds really great.